Before we get into how we can alter musical forms while still maintaining the effective aspects of the form, I'd like to ask the question, how many sonatas did Liszt write? You might initially be thinking his B minor sonata, of course, maybe his Dante, but that's by name only because, interestingly enough, many of his works are actually sonatas, just not called that. For instance, most of his symphonic poems are sonatas, or Sonata-Allegro form. A number of his transcendental etudes are works from his Années de Pèlerinage, and so forth. And he was able to manipulate the Sonata-Allegro form so that it served his purpose rather than boxing him into a set of rigid rules. And we're going to look at two main ways or areas within the form where this can be done effectively. So here are two areas within the form where we can make some changes. In fact, it's often more effective nowadays, at least, compared to the 1700s when it was viewed more rigidly. So rather than viewing it like we're plugging in notes and chords and then it pops out a piece of music, we're able to manipulate it and let it serve our purpose for our project. So the first area is in tonality, because traditionally for writing the primary theme in a minor key, we would usually use the relative major. So for instance, A minor would become C major for the subordinate theme. Or using the dominant, sometimes the subdominant, or other closely related keys, and so on. And more distantly related keys were more common as time went on, but Liszt gives us two really good examples of more unusual key relationships. So the first is the minor tonic to the raised mediant major. Two examples of this in his Faust Symphony. The primary theme is in C minor, but he goes to the mediant as if the tonic for the primary theme were actually in the major, because if it were C major, the mediant would be E major. So he has this relationship between C minor and E major, so he raises the E flat to E, and that becomes the tonic for the subordinate theme. Another example is actually in his symphonic poem Prometheus. We have A minor, again treating the relationship as if it were A major, and so D flat, which is the enharmonic equivalent of C sharp, so from A minor to D flat major for the subordinate theme. This is another interesting key relationship that actually goes back before Liszt's period, even back to Beethoven, but it was not that common. So using a minor tonic for the primary theme, actually using a lowered leading tone minor for the subordinate theme. And his 10th transcendental etude, the F minor study, that's actually in Sonata-Allegro form, as is number 11 in D flat and number 8, the Wildejacht, in C minor. So here are some examples how we can actually use less than traditional key relationships to establish modulation between the different parts of our piece. Now, in other videos, we'll talk about some of these and how we can come up with some of these key relationships. But we'll go on to structure now. So the structure of the form itself, there are two major ways that this has been altered while keeping the effectiveness, like I mentioned, of the form. The first is what's called double function form. This was a term coined by a musicologist in the 1800s, because after analyzing works like Liszt's B minor sonata, Schubert's C major Wanderer Fantasy, or even Schumann's C major Fantasy, they're one movement pieces that follow the traditional exposition, development, recapitulation, sometimes a coda, but at the same time each of those sections act, because they're large enough to act as a first movement, second movement, maybe a scherzo, slow movement, presto finale, and so forth. In Liszt B minor sonata, one of the questions that has been a source of argument, which I don't really see the point of arguing it because it doesn't really matter too much, in my opinion, but the fugal section toward the end, is it part of the development, or does it begin the recapitulation? So there is some ambiguity, and if you really want to get into ambiguous musical form, the Schumann Fantasy is one of the most wonderful examples of altering the form while keeping the effective aspects. The second example is by replacing the development section with a short retransition back to the tonic. It's what we call a slow movement form. Orpheus is a good example. Liszt's symphonic poem Orpheus. It follows this pattern right here. So this is an overview of how we can alter Sonata-Allegro to our benefit. We'll get into more specifics in other videos.